Hello and welcome to this episode of A Bit of Poetry with Dr. O. In this week of podcasts we are considering poems that have to do with autumn, and one of the most famous is John Keats' To Autumn. Season of mists and mellow fruitfulness, close bosom friend of the maturing sun, conspiring with him how to load and bless with fruit the vines that round the thatch-eves run. I'm going to stop there, it's a very long sentence, but he addresses autumn as a season of mists and mellow fruitfulness. The mists have largely been burned off by the early morning sun on this autumn morning, but not too long ago this field was filled with mists as the first frost of the season begins to melt off and rise into the air. And you can still probably see my breath if the light catches it just right. But it's a season of mists and mellow fruitfulness. In the background you may be able to hear the voices of men and boys who are stirring off a couple of kettles of apple butter. And it's a time when the apples are ripe and various other things are ripe. And he describes the autumn as a close friend of the maturing sun. And that he imagines that the autumn and the sun are thinking together, they're conspiring together how to load and bless with fruit the vines that round the thatch-eves run. So thatch, of course, is a kind of roofing material that they would use on cottages in England. And sometimes there would be vines, like grapevines, that would be growing around the thatch-eves. And so he imagines that the sun and the autumn are putting their heads together to ask, how can we fill these fruits so full? Not just the vines, but to bend with apples the mossed cottage-trees, and fill all fruit with ripeness to the core, to swell the gourd and plump the hazel shells with a sweet kernel. So he mentions several other kinds of foods, and he imagines that the fall and the maturing sun are thinking, how can we make these things just as plump and juicy and fruitful as they can possibly be? To set budding more and more, still more later flowers for the bees, until they think warm days will never cease, for summer has o'erbrimmed their clammy cells. So the clammy cells here are the honeycombs that the bees fill with the nectar, and that then turns into honey. And he imagines that the autumn and the maturing sun are making more flowers bloom so that the bees can gather the nectar and put them into their combs, which he here calls clammy cells. Continuing to address autumn, he says, who hath not seen thee oft amid thy store? Sometimes whoever seeks abroad may find thee sitting careless on a granary floor. So he imagines autumn here as a female figure with hair, which we'll see in just a minute, and that she is just sitting on a place where they're reaping the grain, and she's watching placidly and quietly as they reap the grain. Thy soft hair, soft lifted by the winnowing wind. So winnowing is the process of removing the chaff from the grain, and so in old days they might have a pan with the grain and the chaff together, and they would throw the grain up into the air, and the wind would blow the chaff away, and then the grain would settle down. But anyway, where they were removing chaff from the grain, then there would be a wind, and the wind would be blowing the chaff away. And he imagines that autumn is sitting there, and her hair is just soft lifted by the winnowing wind. Or on a half-reaped furrow sound asleep. So he imagines autumn to be a very sleepy sort of a personage, and she has been reaping in the fields, but then she just gets tired, and so she lies down on the half-reaped furrow and goes to sleep, drowsed with the fume of poppies, while thy hook spares the next swath and all its twined flowers. So there's something, the next swath with the reaping hook, imagine a big scythe, Contains many little flowers. That may be the reason why she stopped the reaping. It's because she didn't want to cut down the flowers, but she goes to sleep. And sometimes like a gleaner thou dost keep steady thy laden head across a brook. So you probably have sometimes just had your eyes fixed on something and nothing in particular. You're almost asleep with your eyes open. I think that's the way he imagines autumn here. That she is just looking across a brook in just a very relaxed way. Or by a cider press with patient look thou watchest the last oozings hours by hours. We're making apple butter today, but yesterday we had a cider press and we were making cider, and you just turn that screw and it squeezes the apples down and the juice runs out. And this is the picture that Keats has us imagine, that autumn is just in a very sleepy and a casual way, just watching the last oozings from those apple scraps being squeezed out into the vat of apple cider. Now there are so many songs about spring, but relatively few about autumn, and that's what Keats brings up in this final stanza when he says, "Where are the songs of spring? Aye, where are they? Think not of them, thou hast thy music too." So he's saying, let's not worry about the songs of springtime. Let's sing the beauties of autumn. While barred clouds bloom the soft dying day and touch the stubble plains with rosy hue. So he's imagined that the clouds, which he describes as B-A-R-R-E-D, barred or barred clouds, is kind of a pattern in the autumn sky. And they are blooming like a flower at the close of day, the soft dying day. And in that red sunset, then the fields that have already been reaped just have the stubble left, and they are turned into a rosy hue with the color of the sunset. Then in a wailful choir the small gnats mourn among the river sallows. River sallows are willow trees that grow along the bank, and he imagines these little gnats in just a little sound that may not be a very pleasant thought for you, but it was for Keats to hear the little sounds of these gnats in a wailful choir. They are borne aloft or sinking as the light wind lives or dies. So these little gnats are like a little cloud. You've probably seen some of them. They'll come out on a bright autumn day like this, just a little cloud of flying insects. And when the wind blows, then they're moved with the wind. And when the wind dies, then they fall down. And then he imagines something else, full-grown lambs. So there were little lambs in the spring. Now they're full-grown lambs. Loud bleat from hilly bourne. Hedge crickets sing, and now with treble soft the redbreast whistles from a garden croft, and gathering swallows twitter in the skies. So he imagines the sound of these various birds, the redbreast, the robin redbreast singing, and then the swallows twittering in the skies. The memory from my childhood is not from swallows twittering in the skies, but the great flocks of starlings that would gather in the beech trees that grew in the woods where I played all the time. So, very lovely poem about autumn. And now, without interruption, let me read the whole thing. Season of mists and mellow fruitfulness, close bosom friend of the maturing sun, conspiring with him how to load and bless with fruit the vines that round the thatch-eves run, to bend with apples the mossed cottage-trees, and fill all fruit with ripeness to the core, to swell the gourd and plump the hazel shells with a sweet kernel, to set budding more and still more later flowers for the bees, until they think warm days will never cease, for summer has o'erbrimmed their clammy cells. Who hath not seen thee oft amid thy store? Sometimes whoever seeks abroad may find thee sitting careless on a granary floor, thy hair soft lifted by the winnowing wind, or on a half-reaped furrow sound asleep, drowsed with the fume of poppies, while thy hook spares the next swath and all its twined flowers. And sometimes like a gleaner thou dost keep steady thy laden head across a brook, or by a cider press with patient look, thou watchest the last oozings hours by hours. Where are the songs of spring? Aye, where are they? Think not of them, thou hast thy music too, while barred clouds bloom the soft dying day and touch the stubble plains with rosy hue. Then in a wailful choir the small gnats mourn among the river sallows borne aloft or sinking as the light wind lives or dies, and full-grown lambs loud bleat from hilly bourne. Hedge crickets sing, and now with treble soft the red-breast whistles from a garden croft, and gathering swallows twitter in the skies.